Welcome back to a new series. So, what are we covering today? Well, we're going to start the first topic necessary to start building our Excel object library inside of Python. So, a few weeks ago, actually, I started posting some example code, and pretty much anything related to the Pythonnet library has been kind of centered around this pretty big idea, which is, hey, we want to be able to take an object model that we're really accustomed to using, that being the Excel object model, and using it from Python. And we saw with the Win32com, we could do that. But if we actually use this particular library, the Pythonnet library, we could leverage some built-in assemblies to mimic what we were doing inside the Win32com library and basically recreate all of our source code needed for Python. And so in order to do that, though, we have to understand how to use one particular library. And that library is called the System.Reflection namespace. I'm going to keep doing this. I shouldn't do this. It's a namespace, but I'm going to be jumping, of course, between library and whatever, but keep in mind it's a namespace. Just coming from that Python world. So yeah, it's a really important one. And then just an FYI, this has a lot of printing in this one. So for the most part, I am going to be jumping between some pre-written code that I have into this one. But I do kind of want to give you the idea of how to approach using this library and the type of information that we can get from it. So with that being said, let's get started. All right, so first things first, we're going to import our CLR. So this is our Pythonnet library. After that, hopefully this looks very familiar. We need to add a reference to the namespaces that we plan to use. And so we're going to do CLR add reference, and then we pass through the string, and then it's the namespace that we want to import. So we're going to import the system namespace. And so normally with the system, we can access things like data types and kind of the more core components, if you want to think of it. All right, and then from there, we're going to import our next namespace, and this is going to be the System.Reflection namespace. And so this is going to be the one that we're going to be using to get some information on our objects. Okay, and then once you've done that, you need to import both. And so we need to import system, and we need to import System.Reflection. And it does need to be capital. Sorry about that. It will yell at you, and you will probably get an IntelliSense error. You can just disregard that. It's always going to be there. Okay, and then so I'm just going to test it, make sure everything's good to go. Looks good, so I'm happy. And then what I'll do is I'll kind of make it a little bit larger. All right. Okay, so what is the System.Reflection namespace? Well, let's just go right to the source. So this is a namespace that is provided by Microsoft in the .NET framework. And really what you can think of it as is almost like it's a library that will allow us to get information on our objects. So things like their methods, things like their properties, and there's different information that we can get on those methods. So for example, we can get their names, we can get their parameter values, the optional values. So really what I like to think of it as is almost all the bits and pieces that you need in order to recreate some type of class object or something inside a different language. Now, if you want the formal definition, well, here you go. The System.Reflection namespace contains types that retrieve information about assemblies. Again, this is kind of like our libraries in Python. Modules, members, parameters, and other entities in managed code by examining their metadata. So we can get all the kind of building blocks of our particular namespaces and assemblies and recreate them in another language. But then also it does allow us to do things like late binding and early binding, things along that nature. So that way, if we don't know any information about that particular object, when we're running it at runtime, we can use this namespace to still control and manipulate it. So there's things like the invoke method and things like that. So again, as time kind of goes on, we'll go more into detail when we come across those particular components. But at this point, we're just going to kind of talk high level about certain things. But the nice thing to know about this is it's just allowing us to get all the pieces of our particular code that we need in order to recreate it in Python. So things like the members, that can be anything related to a field, a method, a property, a parameter, you name it. It can potentially be a member and things along that sense. Well, I guess I shouldn't say parameters because parameters are right here, but other things along that. So interfaces too, that's a big one. And so we can access all that information using the System.Reflection namespace. Now, just like a lot of other namespaces, you can see here, there are certain objects we can access, and those objects have methods and properties themselves. So a lot of good information here. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go to the first portion of it. So the first thing we need to do is define file path to our assembly library. This is obviously going to change depending on where your assembly is. It could be in a very different location than where mine is. So for example, if I want to get information on our Excel.Interop assembly, well, mine is, oh geez, I had two. It's in my Visual Studio Tools for Office folder. And so with this one, it has the actual Excel.Interop DLL. And so this is basically almost like our type library in a sense that we can get information on. And so you can actually see it if you want. You'll see all the different interop libraries right here. So one for Visual Basic Editor, there's one for Word, Visio, SharePoint, Publisher. I mean, you pretty much name it, it's all here. There are XML files, and so the XML files basically contain the information necessary for IntelliSense. So this will be things like the member name, their summary, so basically what they do. If there is return arguments, you can specify that. Parameter names, just a lot of different information, but basically it's the information we need in order to kind of populate IntelliSense and things like that. So we will be seeing how to parse these XML files at a later point. Okay, so you've defined the path to your DLL. What do we do with it? Well, we've got to load it. We have to load it basically into our environment. So load the assembly into our environment. And so how does that look like? Well, we can create a new variable. We'll call it Excel.Interop lib, so short for library. We will call our System.Reflection namespace. There is an assembly object inside of it, and that assembly object has a method called loadFile. And what it takes is a string, well, more specifically a string that represents a path to an assembly, and it will load that assembly for us. And so just so you are aware, because unfortunately it won't tell you anything with IntelliSense, you can see here, load file. And there's actually different ways to load a file. There's not just one. But here I'm just using the load file, and then I'm passing through a string. And then normally what it expects is a path to that particular DLL. So lots of good stuff here. I haven't really tried the other ones yet, so I don't really know. Well, I'm not going to say confidently how they exactly work because I just haven't used them yet, but I'm sure they're probably similar to, just the regular load file method. Okay, so once you've loaded your assembly, normally what I like to do is just run it again. You want to make sure there's no errors or things like that. You want to make sure that it was successfully loaded. And then if there were any errors, obviously trying to debug it. I have seen sometimes there is a global cache of the assemblies. Doesn't seem to work with that one. So even though you might see it in there, I've tried importing the assembly that way, and it doesn't seem to work, at least with the Excel one. So I can't say entirely why that is, but my workaround so far has just been specifying the exact path to the DLL. That one seems to be the most reliable, at least from my experience. Okay, So here comes the fun part. Now is where we start printing stuff. Now, just because it's printing, I'm going to kind of save some time and just leverage some pre-built code and kind of explain what's going on. Okay, so the first thing I always like to do is just get some details on our assembly, our interop library, if you want to call it that. Some things I might want to get is the full name, so just the name of that particular assembly, the location, and then the type. So there's actually most of the objects, or at least the class objects in C# do have a get type method, and so this will return the type that it would be under the in the C# environment and stuff like that. Kind of speaking outside my realm a little bit, but we'll go with that. And then again, if you do want to kind of see a little bit more about those properties, you can actually just go right here and you will see all the different pieces of information you want to get on it. So permission set, location is fully trusted, is dynamic. So a lot of good information. Some of it's more important than others, but it really just depends. Again, what are you trying to do? What is the information you need to get from this assembly, and where does it exactly live? And then again, there's some other stuff too. So, get name, get object data, get referenced assembly. So it's actually kind of a neat one. So if you want to see the assemblies that are referenced in this particular assembly that we're on, I do use this one. So it's kind of nice. Just really good information. I mean, again, if you're trying to understand the assembly a little bit more, I think it works great. So let's print it out and see what we get. All right, so looks like the assembly is called Microsoft Office.Interop Excel. It's version 15. Culture is neutral, and then public key token. Don't ask me what these two are. I'm not entirely positive, but I think this one is, because there's like language settings that you can set for different assemblies, so if I remember correctly, but I'm not entirely sure. And then you can actually see too where this assembly is located. So when we load this assembly, it actually puts it in the GAC. So the global assembly cache for the .NET environment. And then again, you kind of see the file path right here. And then you can also see that, well, assembly is just simply a System.Reflection runtime assembly. Now, more specifically, this is I guess it's more of a runtime one because again, we've loaded it. And so that's kind of, I guess, why we would consider that. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's kind of take the next step and start getting some more information on it. So maybe, for example, get all the referenced assemblies. All right, so we're going to say for assembly in Excel.Interop lib, and then it's get referenced assemblies. Perfect. And then once we do that, what we can do is we can print out some information. Now again, because it's printing it, I am going to keep it relatively simple at this point and just copy and paste, because for the most part, I'm hoping most people know how to call properties and methods at this point. All right. So again, all I'm getting is the full name. I'm getting the type, getting the version, and then for some reason I had code base. I want to see what code base is again. Code base gets location of assembly as specified originally. Oh, okay. Well, that doesn't really seem to be interesting, but we'll see what happens. So for each one, there are a couple referenced assemblies. So the first one is the Microsoft Core library. Interesting how this one changed though, right? This is actually a System.Reflection.assembly name. So it does change a little bit. You can't necessarily assume it's always going to be the same type. So the next one is the Visual Basic Editor interop. So again, controlling the Visual Basic Editor. Where else is the nice one? Office. So the Office assembly. So I think there's only 3 actually. So that's not too bad. But it's kind of good to know where it's like, you're trying to determine like, hey, what assemblies does this one use? Well, now you know. So now you can get that information and you're good to go. All right, so from here, we're going to start getting into the more, I would call the meat of it. So we're going to actually start getting all the types that exist in this particular assembly, and we're going to start parsing the information from them. Now, there are different types of types. So there's interfaces, there's classes, there are enumerations, and then there's structures. And then I have a kind of, at this point, an unknown, because if there's one that I'm missing, I kind of just store it there. The main ones that we're usually concerned with are the interfaces, the classes, and the enumerations. For the most part, the Excel.Interop library doesn't actually appear to have any structures inside of them, so structured types. From what I've been told, the structure type is, I guess, just a more lightweight version of a class type. What that exactly means, well, I think we'll find that out later when I kind of get there and I have to work for one of them. But yeah, at this point, just know that it's more of a light version of a class type. And then obviously the classes and interfaces are ones that we're going to be using pretty heavily, and then enumerations for things like constants. So with that being said, again, more copying, but this is just to save some time. All right. So I just initialized some lists that's going to hold the different pieces of information. Okay, and then from here, I'm going to start looping through the pieces of information. Now, an assembly basically contains a collection of type objects, right? And so these type objects are the things that contain the information we need to recreate the code in Python. So what we need to use is for our Excel.Interop library variable or object or runtime assembly, there is a method called getTypes. And this grabs all the type objects in our interrupt assembly. So grab all the types and store them. So for, and I just give it something like, Excel type in Excel.Interop lib. There is a get types S at the end. Very, very important to put type S at the end or else it ain't gonna work. So we wanna get all the types inside of our interop library. And then from here, we need to check what type it is. This is where it's going to help to go back to the documentation. The only reason I say that is, especially if you're new to it, it's going to be somewhat confusing. And so it's hard to sometimes pinpoint exactly what you're dealing with. But basically what happens is we get an array of type objects. If you click that type one, you will see these type objects have different properties. So we can see if it's an assembly, if it's attributes. We can see the attributes. We can see the assembly. We can see if it's a COM object, is a class. So basically the way I categorize them is using these properties. Because, for example, if we know it's an enumeration, well, then we can know it's an enumeration type. And then later in our code, we can start parsing that appropriately. So we use these properties to help us classify what it is. And then from there, we leverage basically that organized hierarchy to start parsing those particular types in more detail. So this is by far, I would say, one of the more confusing steps, but I've done my best to kind of make it as straightforward as possible. But just keep in mind, types can be different things. And so part of it is understanding what is the thing that we're looking for. So for example, see if it's an interface. And so we'll say if Excel type equals, is interface. So we'll call the is interface property that equals true. Then interfaces, so call the interfaces list, call the append method and put that type in that particular list. So basically what we do is we kind of just copy this step multiple times and we just look for the possible different conditions that it can be. So for example, one of them is class. So is it a class object? Well, if that's the case, then put it in the classes list. Okay, that's perfect. So that takes care of that one. There's a few more that we have to do. Perfect. So we need is enum. And that one is enumerations. So this is going to be our enumerations. And then we have, what's the next one? Oh yes, this is the tricky one. Value type and not Excel type is enum. Value types can be enumerations, but in order to get a structure, we need to basically get the ones that aren't in enumeration. And also here, this is again just showing you a different way to write it. Technically, I'm not saying equals true or anything like that. So nothing really stopping me from doing that, but I try to make it a little bit more apparent just so people understand exactly what I need this to be in order to add it to that list. So it's very important that you understand that it's got to meet that condition in order to be added to the list. Otherwise, you potentially could get something you don't want. Okay, and at this point, if I don't know what it is, I'm just going to store it in an unknown list, and I just put it there. Luckily, I didn't encounter anything that seemed to go in that list. If somebody encounters that, please let me know. Okay, and so from that, we're going to just wrap things up for this video. So we'll print out the information that we've so far parsed, and you might be surprised a little bit to see how much information is truly in there. It's a lot, but all I'm doing is I'm just counting each list, and I'm trying to basically create a little summary for us. And we can see there's 713 interfaces, there's 140 classes, there's 263 enumerations, and there are 0 structures. So that overall is pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think for the most part, we got everything. So very, very useful. So with that being said, though, I am going to wrap up the video. If you have any questions at this point about using the System.Reflection namespace, or just trying to better understand why I approach something in a particular way, feel free to put them down in the comments below, and I will try to get back to you. And then I think, what's our next video? Next video, yes, we're going to start parsing the classes. So that's going to be our first one. And then most of that stuff, I think, is just getting the information. So it's trying to give you an idea of how to see the information, things like that. And then what we're going to do with the interfaces is go a little bit more in detail to get methods and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say overall complicated, just more printing stuff, calling properties, nothing super fancy. I call this I just want to know as much about it as possible, and I just want to store it in an organized fashion. How do I do that? This is kind of the video to do that. It's just getting all the information you need. So that's kind of what's going to be coming up next, and we will see you in the next video.